A body is found in the lake. Lungs filled with salt water. A door locked from the inside. And one name whispered through the halls of Mallow Hill. Miss Marple. They say the dead don't speak, but someone, or something, wants the truth uncovered. A long-buried secret. A killer hiding in plain sight. And a trail of clues only the sharpest minds will notice. Think you can solve the case before Miss Marple? Pay attention. Every shadow matters. Every glance could be a clue. Subscribe now and hit the bell. You'll need sharp eyes for this one. Drop your theory in the comments before Chapter 10. And if you're right, you'll get a personal shout-out in the next hour next story, as if someone somewhere still believed in the dignity of proper correspondence. Miss Marple, seated at her lace-covered breakfast table in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, read the neat script once, then again. The handwriting belonged to Clarissa Havisham, a name that carried weight in certain circles, though not the kind that appeared often in the papers. Mallow Hill, it read, was in need of a touch of gentility. A gathering was planned. Nothing ostentatious, merely an autumn weekend among acquaintances, a rekindling of old bonds, a reprieve from the damp hush of countryside isolation, and in the middle of the letter, almost invisible, unless one was inclined to read between the lines, an invitation laced with urgency. Mallow Hill, a name seldom spoken in company, stood aloof on the edge of Devonshire moorland, surrounded by a thicket of ash trees, and an ever-present mist that seldom lifted before noon. Those who remembered it spoke of a beautiful decline, a once grand estate retreating quietly into itself. Miss Marple, ever perceptive, sensed more than seasonal melancholy in the phrasing, and so with little fanfare she accepted. The arrangements were made, the luggage packed, and by Thursday she was en route. The carriage arrived not long past 3, its wheels crunching over gravel softened by decades of neglect. The first view of the manor did not disappoint, for it confirmed everything she'd suspected. Ivy curled in on itself over the grey stone facade, windows blinked dimly through lace curtains, and chimneys exhaled as though sighing from some great exertion. The front door was ajar, just slightly, as if unsure whether to welcome or resist. It was Miss Plight who greeted her, narrow-shouldered, sharp-eyed, with a voice like oversteeped tea and fingers that never stopped twitching at the hem of her apron. She did not speak of the weather, nor did she offer tea. Instead, she murmured something about the drawing-room and turned away, leaving Miss Marple to remove her gloves slowly, taking in each detail as if it might vanish at a blink. There was a grandfather clock in the entrance hall, tall, proud and wholly dysfunctional. Its hands pointed firmly to midnight, though the ticking continued, a dull mechanical throb that matched neither time nor rhythm, a curious thing for no one seemed to mind, nor comment. Nearby a door stood firmly shut, its brass knob dulled by use but polished nonetheless. Later, she would note that no one opened it. Later still, she would note that no one ever spoke of what lay behind it. Clarissa Havisham was exactly as remembered, poised, enigmatic, with a calm that bordered on disinterest. She moved like someone half in love with their surroundings, and her welcome, though sincere, was oddly rehearsed. Her brother Edmund, taller, colder, arrived late to tea, his hand briefly touching Clarissa's shoulder with a familiarity that did not come. He apologized without inflection, his voice smooth, his eyes grey, unblinking. Then came Revan, Lomas, well-meaning, affable, and wholly out of place, as if his presence had been arranged by a committee, and he had only now realized it. He sat with a posture that suggested restraint, spoke with a deliberate warmth, and eyed the corners of the room as if looking for cues. Dr. Armitage, by contrast, seemed anchored to the earth by some invisible weight. A local with years pressed into his spine, he spoke little, observed much, and never quite seemed to leave the threshold of any room he entered. The dog, a lean Irish setter, belonging to no one in particular, refused the drawing-room entirely. He would stand at the door, whimper once, then retreat to the back hallway where he paced in silence, glancing over his shoulder as if counting who had gone in and who had not come out. The first evening passed with the politeness of strangers pretending to be acquaintances. Clarissa played piano softly, a tune that echoed faintly through the old woodwork. Edmund stood at the fireplace, unmoving, while the others sipped sherry and shared glances that fell short of genuine conversation. The drawing-room was warm, the fire crackled, and yet Miss Marple felt it. The the quiet tension that lies not in words, but in the refusal to speak them. The following morning brought rain, and with it, a curious silence. Miss Blight served breakfast, with the intensity of someone fulfilling a debt, rather than a duty. The eggs were cold, the toast untouched. Clarissa was absent, and Edmund, when asked, simply replied she was resting. Resting from what? No one dared inquire. It was during this breakfast that Miss Marple noticed the first clue, a framed photograph atop the mantelpiece in the small parlour, just beside the drawing room. 6 people stood in formal attire beside the lake at the back of the estate, but it was the 7th figure that caught her eye, only half visible at the edge of the frame. A woman or girl, her face blurred, her dress white, her feet partly submerged. It was old, the photograph, the glass was cracked, and yet the image unnerved. When asked, Miss Blight looked up too quickly, then away. "Oh, that's an old family affair," she said. "Best not to trouble yourself with old ghosts, Miss Marple." But ghosts, as Miss Marple well knew, were rarely the problem. It was the living who preferred their stories untold. She explored the house quietly that afternoon, under the guise of familiarizing herself. The west corridor led to the disused music room. Dust hung in strips from the chandelier. An old harpsichord sat neglected in the corner, one key pressed down without relief. The east wing, curiously, was locked. A small chain and a brass sign read, "Servants' Quarters, closed for renovation." Yet Miss Marple noticed that the floor beneath the door was recently swept. Clarissa reappeared at tea with no explanation, her dress impeccable, her hair pinned just so. She laughed when laughter was needed, asked after Marple's garden, and answered nothing. She wasn't directly asked. Edmund remained unreadable. Reverend Lomas, perhaps sensing his own irrelevance, mentioned organising a small chapel gathering for Sunday morning. Armitage raised an eyebrow but said nothing. By candlelight the house looked different. Shadows lengthened in peculiar directions. The ticking of the grandfather clock, still fixed on midnight, grew louder in the quiet hours. Miss Marple heard it in her room at night, the slow, deliberate tick-tick, unburdened by progress. Somewhere beneath it, she imagined the creak of footfalls, not hurried, not hesitant, simply present. There was a story in this house, that much she knew. It whispered through the stairwell, tugged gently at the curtains, echoed in the piano's final note, before Clarissa's hand fell still. And though no one spoke of it, though no one named it, every soul within Mallow Hill seemed to behave as though it might, at any moment, make itself known again. Behind the scenes, something darker was lurking, not loud, not urgent, just there. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. So we begin. But before we continue this case, if you're captivated by the quiet dangers of countryside secrets and the unraveling of elegant lies, do consider subscribing. You'll want to see this through to the final clue. Now, shall we proceed? Chapter 2: A Whisper at Midnight. There is, in the deep countryside, a quiet that rests not upon silence, but upon the absence of answers. It clings to the trees and the stone walls. It waits in the damp folds of morning mist, and it lingers, always, just beyond what one is willing to admit aloud. At Mallow Hill, this quiet did not greet. It observed, discreet, patient, thoughtful, and on Miss Marple's second night, within the manor's walls, the quiet did not rest. It whispered. The time, according to the broken clock in the entry hall, was forever midnight. According to Miss Marple's bedside watch, it was just past 2. Rain tapped gently at the window panes, a sound so delicate it might have been imagined had it not danced rhythmically with the occasional creak of timber from within the old bones of the house itself. All had settled hours ago. The dog had ceased its pacing, Clarissa had retired without another word, and the hallways, long and cool, had stretched themselves into shadows. And yet, the voice came. It was faint at first, like the rustling of pages in a nearby room, or the soft sigh of someone turning in their sleep. But no pages turned, and no bed besides her own was so near. The voice, if it could be called that, fluttered just beneath the range of understanding, hovering at the edges of discernment. too low for content, but too distinct for coincidence. Miss Marple, unalarmed but infinitely alert, sat up slowly, her fingers brushing aside the heavy blanket with care. She did not reach for light. She listened, outside her window, which faced a modest courtyard framed by ash trees. Nothing moved. The branches swayed only slightly in the night wind, their silhouettes projected faintly onto the sheer curtain. And yet, again, the sound, closer now. A breath, a hush, and then something unmistakable. Her name, Jane. It was spoken softly, but clearly, not affectionate, not angry, just present. A name spoken not to beckon, but to acknowledge. Miss Marple stood, carefully, her slippers soundless against the rug. The floorboards beneath her protested only slightly as she stepped closer to the window, then paused. No figure stood outside, though the fog made it difficult to see much beyond the nearest tree. The ash branches curled in unusual directions, as though uncertain whether to stretch toward the manor or away. The voice did not come again, only the hush of wind and the odd, persistent ticking of the grandfather clock from below, its hands still pointed without apology to the hour of 12. She opened the curtain fully, then the window itself. A gust of moist air entered, followed by silence, and then, from somewhere behind her, not outside but within the hall, a soft creak. Miss Marple turned. The corridor was empty. The oil lamp at its end glowed weakly, casting amber light over the patterned runner. Doors remained closed. The dog did not bark. She stood for a moment, her breath measured, gaze lingering on the far end of the hall, where one portrait hung just slightly crooked, its frame larger than necessary for the canvas it held. It had not been askew earlier, of that she was certain. The woman in the painting, perhaps 40, wore a pale gown and a soft expression, seated beside what appeared to be the lake behind the manor. Her eyes, calm and indirect, had been painted with particular care. Miss Marple had taken note of it on her arrival. Now they met hers directly, not merely a trick of angle or light. The gaze had shifted. She approached slowly. With each step the air felt cooler, as if the hallway were shrinking. The portrait's frame cast a small shadow, one that, as she neared, appeared to stretch further than its origin should allow. She stood before the painting, then turned, sharply, toward the guest rooms. No doors had opened, and yet, down the corridor, perhaps near the drawing room, someone shifted. A door barely ajar moved almost imperceptibly. There was no wind. She noted the room, the third on the right. She did not approach it then. Instead, she returned to her room, closed the window, and lit the lamp beside her bed. She did not sleep again that night. The following morning dawned, reluctantly, as if unsure of the welcome it might receive. Breakfast was again a quiet affair. Clarissa appeared, smiling but distant, her eyes faintly rimmed with sleeplessness. Edmund entered last, murmured a greeting, then poured coffee with the absent-mindedness of a man performing tasks he no longer enjoyed. The dog sat beneath the table, unmoved. Miss Marple, placing her spoon delicately on its saucer, inquired if anyone had heard voices in the night. Clarissa shook her head. "The wind plays strange games here," she offered, though the smile that followed was too quick, too rehearsed. Edmund said nothing. Later, during her quiet examination of the hall, she returned to the portrait. It had been straightened, not by staff. Mrs. Blight had been occupied since early morning in the kitchen, no one else mentioned, and when Miss Marple gently remarked on the woman's unusually lifelike eyes, Clarissa, after a beat too long, simply replied, "Yes, she was very loved." That afternoon, a chill remained even in the sunlit parlour. Clarissa played the piano again, the same wandering melody as before. The notes occasionally faltered. Edmund stood in the bay window, arms crossed, watching the lake without expression. Miss Marple took her tea without comment, but she noticed the picture frame on the table beside her was turned slightly away from the guest. Adjusting it, she revealed a photograph of 3 children, one of whom wore a necklace shaped like a crescent moon. It was the same necklace worn by the woman in the hallway painting. She said nothing. The day passed unmarked by incident, but not untouched by unease. The staff kept to themselves. The dog refused the drawing room again. Rive Lomas arrived late for supper, apologizing vaguely for an errand that no one had asked about. Dr. Armitage lingered at the edge of the room, offering fewer words than ever. That night, Miss Marple left her lamp on, and at precisely midnight by her watch this time, not the clock in the hall, the voice returned. Not a name this time, a question. "Why did you come back?" Whispered not in fear, nor hope. It was curious, almost weird. She rose, stepped into the hallway, and this time approached the door that had moved, the third on the right. It was closed again, but not locked. Her fingers, cool and deliberate, touched the knob, and turned. The room was empty, unused. Dust motes swirled in the lamplight. A dressing table stood in one corner. On it, an old brush, a cracked compact, and a mirror, and beside the mirror, a thin, yellowed envelope, addressed simply to E. She did not open it, not then. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching. Behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. We continue this investigation, quietly, thoroughly, unflinching.
Chapter 3. The Woman in the Water. There are places where the surface of water behaves more like memory than reflection, where it does not mirror what one sees, but holds what has been seen. The lake behind Mallow Hill, framed on 3 sides by reed beds and a slight decline of moss-covered earth, was not wide nor deep, no more than a pond by technical standards, but it held something the air above refused to name. Locals spoke of it sparingly, visitors rarely noticed it, and on the morning after, Miss Marple found the yellowed envelope in the unused guest room. The lake gave something back. It was the gardener who found her, a man of few words and fewer opinions, who reported what he had seen with the tone of one who would rather not have seen anything at all. The body of a young woman, caught against the edge of the stones, her hair tangled with lichen, her clothes sodden, but recognizably of recent make, lay there as though she had been placed rather than discovered. Miss Marple arrived shortly after the alarm, walking quietly behind Clarissa and Edmund, whose reactions diverged in ways that were difficult not to notice. Clarissa halted several paces from the edge, her hand resting against a tree trunk, with more stability than necessity. Edmund, straight-backed and silent, peered down without comment. Dr. Armitage crouched beside the figure, gloves already on, his breath short and audible. The local constable had been summoned, but in such remote places, help was a matter of geography rather than urgency. No one asked Miss Marple to step back. No one suggested she shield herself from the view. Instead, she stood just far enough away to see what others overlooked. The woman, no older than 30, was unfamiliar to the current household. Her dress was modest, her shoes practical, her fingernails clean, but there was something unusual, something that made Dr. Armitage frown as he rose. "No signs of trauma," he murmured, almost to himself, then glanced toward the manor, as though it might offer him a second opinion. Clarissa turned. "Do you know her?" He did not reply. It was not until the following day, when the local authorities sent word from the coroner, that a name was offered. Lucille, a former maid, employed at Mallow Hill 6 years earlier, presumed to have left suddenly, without farewell or notice, on the same week as a small fire in the East Wing that was never officially investigated. Clarissa said nothing. Edmund folded the letter and placed it back into its envelope without reading it aloud. But Miss Marple saw the reaction most clearly in Mrs. Blight, who dropped a porcelain cup for the first time in 30 years, and without a word, left the room before anyone could speak. The autopsy revealed a detail that changed the nature of everything. The cause of drowning had been recorded without hesitation, but the contents of the lungs, salt water, not the lake, not the pond, salt, oceanic, impossible. No salt water body lay within 20 miles of Mallow Hill. The well, the taps, the rain, all fresh. The lake itself tested, as it had been many times, especially after the flooding of 38, no salt, and yet her lungs had held it. The whisper that had lingered at the edges of Mallow Hill's corridors now stretched outward, beyond the estate, into the village, not spoken above a hush, and never within earshot of the Havishams, but spoken nonetheless. A curse, they said. Lucille had never left, some insisted. She had been waiting, or trapped, or both. Miss Marple visited the lake alone that evening, walking slowly, her cane occasionally breaking the crust of moss that veiled the stones. The air was cool but windless. No ripples disturbed the surface. She watched it. The silence wasn't empty. It was watched. Somewhere behind her, a shutter clattered gently, though there was no breeze. A curtain in one of the east-facing windows billowed inward. The door to the east wing, still locked, had not been opened in years, and yet that curtain did not belong to any room currently in use. She returned indoors before twilight, passing once more the portrait in the hallway. The woman's gaze still held hers, but now, beneath the frame, a thin line had formed, moisture perhaps, or some unnoticed imperfection in the wall. It ran in a slow, meandering trickle downward, vanishing into the baseboard. Miss Marple paused only briefly, then continued. By the fire, Clarissa sat alone, hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the window though her eyes focused on nothing. When Miss Marple joined her, she did not look over. "Did Lucille have family?" she asked softly. Clarissa shook her head. "None local. No one came when she left. No one asked." Miss Marple tilted her head. She was well liked. Clarissa's smile, when it came, was careful. Later that night, the grandfather clock ticked on, still at midnight. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, reading a journal she had brought for light diversion, but could not now focus on. She glanced toward the mirror above the hearth. For a moment in its reflection, she thought she saw the woman from the painting. Not her face, not her figure, just the shape of her eyes, watching, still, waiting. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. Chapter 4. The Library Key. There is a difference between rooms that are forgotten and those that are avoided. One gathers dust with the patience of time, the other with the weight of intention. And at Mallow Hill, the library was very much the latter. It had stood locked since Miss Marple's arrival, mentioned only once, and then indirectly by Clarissa, who had simply said, with a polite flick of her wrist, toward a corridor beyond the conservatory, "That door sticks dreadfully, I'm afraid." A remark made with such practiced casualness that it practically begged to be ignored. But nothing invites a mind such as Miss Marple's like a topic politely swept aside. She had first tried the door 2 days prior, her fingers grazing the cold brass knob, which turned but did not open. No keyhole could be seen, but there was, very faintly, the outline of a once concealed plate, painted over in the same faded cream as the rest of the panelling, yet betraying a shape more deliberate than merely decorative. And today, on a morning of tentative sunlight and uneasy silence following Lucille's reappearance in the lake, Miss Marple had found a small brass key beneath a loose brick in the hearth of the music room, placed, not dropped, wrapped in oilskin, and stamped faintly with an L. The key fit the hidden lock, not quite perfectly. There was a moment of hesitation, the kind that exists between decision and consequence, and then, a soft click. The door opened slowly, resisting with the groan of long-stilled hinges, and revealed a space that had not seen purpose in many years. The library was unlike the rest of the house, where other rooms bore the patina of maintained decay. This one wore its abandonment more deliberately. The air was stale with dust, but untouched by intrusion. The drapes remained drawn, allowing only thin veins of morning light to slice through in uneven lines, illuminating shelves lined with books that sagged beneath their own history. On the far wall stood a desk, mahogany broad, with a cracked leather blotter and a brass lamp whose bulb had long ceased to function. Behind it, a tall chair of green velvet, worn at the arms, was turned slightly, as though the occupant had risen mid-thought and never returned. Miss Marple approached with care, her steps measured, her gaze drawn not to the shelves, nor the desk, but to the cabinet beneath the western window. It was here, behind a pane of leaded glass, that she discovered the journal. There were 4, each bound in brown calfskin, the edges mottled with age, the spines numbered in faded ink. The handwriting inside was legible and practiced, unmistakably masculine, though with an almost childlike neatness, as if the writer had been taught penmanship at an early age and never quite outgrew the precision. They were dated across a span of 6 years, ending just a few months before the fire in the East Wing, and the entries, well, they began innocuously enough. Observations of estate business, tenant complaints, occasional commentary on weather and crops. But by the 3rd journal, a tone shifted. The author, presumably Edmund's father, Algernon Havisham, had begun to document something else entirely. His dreams. He wrote of a girl, not a woman, not a servant or visitor or stranger, a girl in white. She came, he said at first, in dreams that felt like memories, standing at the edge of the lake, her hair too long for her age, her expression fixed, not in sorrow or joy, but in expectation, always expectation. She would raise one hand, as if to beckon him, and say nothing, and then she would vanish. The entries grew more erratic. He questioned his memory, his perception. He described waking to wet footprints on the stone outside his bedroom. He wrote that the girl had once spoken, and when she did, she had said only this: "You left," and again, later, "You heard me, you did nothing." The ink in these passages was darker, more pressed into the page, the script larger, and though Algernon attempted to dismiss them as dreams, the detail in his writing betrayed a man whose certainty was being slowly eroded. Miss Marple read them all slowly, methodically. When she reached the end, she closed the final journal and sat still for several minutes, the silence of the room growing thick around her. Then, she stood, returned the journals to their shelf, and pulled one sheet, just one, from the drawer of the desk. A letter, half-written, never sent, addressed to no one. The ink faded almost to illegibility, but the final sentence remained clear. "If she returns, tell Edmund to keep away from the water." That evening, Miss Marple joined the family for supper. The conversation was thinner than usual, the shadows in the dining room longer, despite the hour. Clarissa served soup with a hand that trembled only slightly. Edmund did not eat. After the meal, Miss Marple asked, with the kind of nonchalance only the sharpest minds can feign, whether the library had always been kept locked. Edmund looked up. "It was my father's room. There wasn't much point in keeping it open, yet the key was hidden," she said softly. He hesitated. "That was his decision." "I see." There was a moment then, brief, but telling. "Did your father keep journals?" she continued. Edmund's expression stiffened. "No. That's a shame. They can be so useful for sorting the mind." "He was unwell," Edmund replied quickly. Toward the end, confused, he imagined things, spoke of nonsense. Clarissa stood. He believed in spirits. Edmund glared at her, but she only lifted her chin, as though daring him to say more. He did not. Later that night, Miss Marple passed the library once more. It remained unlocked, but the light inside flickered, though no lamp had been lit. There was one truth left unspoken.
and it was waiting for her. Chapter 5. The Séance. It began, as many regrettable decisions do, beneath the surface of polite conversation, hinted at first as amusement, then escalated by curiosity, and finally arranged under the pretense of harmless entertainment, though the room into which it was invited had never once welcomed amusement, and would not begin now. Clarissa Havisham, seated with the composed energy of a hostess attempting to outpace unease, proposed it during tea, her tone light, the corners of her mouth drawn just slightly upward, her fingers steady against the rim of a porcelain cup that had hours earlier rattled once in her grip, for no visible reason. "A séance," she said, as if offering a new flavour of preserve. "Nothing too serious, just a bit of atmosphere. We could use some levity." No one objected. Miss Marple, seated beside the fireplace with her knitting poised and unmoving in her lap, regarded Clarissa with the faintest of smiles, one that did not reach her eyes. Across the room, Edmund said nothing, but his gaze narrowed slightly, and his hand flexed once where it rested on the arm of the settee. Lomas, whose spiritual sensibilities leaned more toward structured liturgy than ancestral visitation, chuckled dryly and returned to his paper, though not before glancing, just briefly, at the door to the drawing-room. Dr. Armitage frowned, but offered no comment. The medium arrived that evening, precisely at 7. She was not local, her name was Mrs. Lindell, and she came highly recommended by a former guest of the Havishams. Someone, Clarissa explained, who had written to say Mrs. Lindell possessed an extraordinary sensitivity to unsettled places. She was neither flamboyant nor frail. She carried herself with a kind of unassuming clarity, wore no exotic fabrics, and bore no talismans. She simply arrived, shook hands, and stated quite plainly that the house was loud. It was Clarissa who led the arrangement of the room, candles lit precisely, chairs drawn in a near circle, the table cleared of ornament, save for a single glass dish, filled with salt, and 2 iron keys, placed at its edge. Blight lit the fire, then promptly retreated, her mouth drawn into a line so thin it could hardly be said to have volume at all. The séance began. No one spoke at first. The candles flickered, the fire crackled, and somewhere above them, a floorboard creaked, in what could be dismissed as temperature shift or settling beams, though it was not followed by another. Mrs. Lindell closed her eyes, her hands, resting palms upward on her knees, did not tremble. She spoke in a voice just above whisper. She asked for calm, for permission, for silence. She asked to be shown what lingered, and for a moment there was only quiet. Then she inhaled, sharply, as if something unseen had crossed the threshold of her mind, and stepped directly into the room. Her voice, when she spoke again, was different, lower, not theatrical, not performed, simply altered. She turned her head, as though hearing something behind her, though nothing stood there. Her brow furrowed, and she leaned forward. "A child," she said, "a girl, dressed in white." Edmund stood abruptly. "This is nonsense." Clarissa reached for his arm, but he pulled away. Mrs. Lindell continued. "She does not speak, but she looks, she waits." She stopped, her eyes flew open, her chair scraped backward as she stood in one sharp movement. "No," she said, breathless. "No, she is not alone." The fire cracked again. The candles trembled, then guttered out, all at once, as though struck by breath. Mrs. Lindell turned toward the window, her voice louder now, urgent. "The one who watches is still in the house." With that, she left. No farewell, no apology. She swept past the circle, past the hall, her coat half buttoned, and was gone into the night, with no carriage waiting, and no direction given. The room remained silent. Miss Marple stood first, lighting a nearby lamp with care. She moved toward the window, where Mrs. Lindell had looked. Nothing. The courtyard beyond was still, the moon low, the dog, somewhere in the distance. let out a low whine, and then fell quiet. It was Edmund who spoke next. She was unstable. She should never have been invited. Clarissa said nothing. The group disbanded in silence, but Miss Marple remained. She stepped into the drawing room again. The fire was out, the air chilled, and just there on the carpet by the far window, a footprint, small, bare. She followed them. There were 5 in each, growing fainter, but leading unmistakably toward the locked inner door, a door that had not opened in years, behind which, supposedly, nothing remained but old furniture and forgotten trunks. The footprint stopped at the door, but the door itself was dry. She bent down. The footprint was real, mud, faint streaks of lichen, but the carpet had not been damp when they entered. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching. Behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And so we continue.
Chapter 6. The Missing Pages. Some truths are not hidden by time, but by effort, not lost, but removed, carefully, deliberately, as one might extract a thorn embedded too deep in flesh. And so it was, early the next morning, as dawn crept sluggishly across the mist-veiled lawns of Mallow Hill, that Miss Marple returned to the library alone, following the echoes of a night that had unsettled the house, and perhaps shaken something loose beneath it. The door had remained unlocked, its hinges groaning in protest. As she entered, the faint scent of ashwood and neglected leather still clinging to the darkened air. The journals, those written in the precise, steady hand of Algernon Havisham, remained on the shelf beneath the tall western window, exactly where she had left them. Or so she thought. It was not until she opened the 3rd volume that she noticed the absence. 5 pages, toward the end, had been removed. Torn, not cut, the edges jagged, the paper thinned where it had resisted. It had not been done years ago. No, the disturbance was recent. The remaining pages bore the indentations of fingers that had pressed too hard, and a faint smear of something, mud perhaps, or something darker, clung to the lower margin of one corner. She ran a finger along the tier, slowly, thoughtfully, then replaced the book and turned back toward the desk, where the leather blotter now bore a small indentation, square, about the size of a box. Whatever had been placed there had been removed, hastily, and without care for concealment. She had just closed the desk drawer when Mrs. Blight's voice reached her, thin, urgent, rising through the corridors, not in speech, but in sound. A gasp, a half-formed exclamation, then the unmistakable clatter of hurried footsteps retreating from something rather than towards someone. Miss Marple did not run, but neither did she delay. The hallway outside the library was unusually cold. As she reached the 2nd-floor landing, she was met by Dr. Armitage, whose complexion was greyed by more than age. "The vicar," he said. No more was necessary. Lomas had taken, since arrival, the smallest of the guest rooms by personal request, a modest chamber near the north staircase, with a view of the chapel ruins beyond the orchard. He had always risen early, a habit formed over decades of ecclesiastical routine, but this morning, his door had remained closed well past the hour. Mrs. Blight, suspecting illness, had knocked, no response, and so, the key was used. Inside, the room was in quiet disarray, the bed untouched, a lamp on its side, and through the open door to the adjoining water closet, the surface of the tub still full, shone dully in the weak morning light. He lay there, arms folded neatly, eyes closed, face composed. The door had been locked from within, the window lamp. No sign of violence, no indication of struggle, and yet the room held the unmistakable tension of interruption. A towel lay half-folded on the floor. The mirror, above the sink, had cracked along its lower edge, a fracture radiating outward like a starburst frozen in the act of expansion. Dr. Armitage stood silently as the constable,
summoned once again from the village, took notes. Clarissa sat with her back straight, hands unmoving on her lap, her gaze fixed at a point somewhere far beyond the room. Edmund remained outside. Miss Marple, who had entered last, said little. She merely looked at the puddle forming beneath the sideboard, at the faint imprint of a boot just outside the door, at the book of Psalms on the nightstand, now damp at the edges as if dipped in water, not recently drawn from any household tap. Later, in the drawing room, Clarissa spoke quietly. He was troubled. Edmund did not meet her eyes. There's no reason to assume he wasn't simply tired. We all are. Miss Marple stirred her tea, then set it down without drinking. There are pages missing from your father's journals, she said, directing her words not at Edmund, but toward the fire. No one replied. She continued, they described the girl in white, the one who appears by the water, the one who says nothing, but wait. Clarissa stood slowly, her cup left trembling slightly on its saucer. This house does not keep secrets well. It was not a confession. It was an observation. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the library once more. The window was open now, though she had left it closed. A draught stirred the curtains, and upon the floor beneath the window lay one of the iron keys from the séance, no longer on the table where it had been left, but placed deliberately, facing east. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching. We continue, but if you've followed this far, and wish to see the rest unfold, you may subscribe to stay close to the story. The end is never as distant as it appears. Chapter 7. Reflections. In houses built on secrets, glass remembers. It records not just what passes before it, but also what lingers behind. Light, after all, is obedient. It follows the rules. But reflection is a choice. And by the morning following the vicar's sudden passing, Mallow Hill had begun to choose what it showed and what it did not. Miss Marple had risen early, earlier than most, moving quietly through the corridors, as if in search of something she had not yet decided to find. The house was still. The air tasted faintly of silver polish and dust, and though she met no one on her walk, she did not feel alone. It began with the mirror in the east hallway, oval, ornate, framed in brass, now dulled to an unremarkable bronze. It hung outside the music room, and had done so, according to Mrs. Blight, for as long as the manor had stood. This morning, Miss Marple noted, the frame was off-centre, subtly but distinctly. The angle drew the eye toward the floor where a narrow track of moisture had dried into a faint trail, leading nowhere, as though someone had passed without leaving footprints. When she looked into the glass, it did not return her gaze immediately. There was a lag, not a trick of light, not a delay in her vision, but something less tangible. Her face was there, eventually, but behind it, no, beside it, something else. The shape was not well defined, but it was present, as one might observe a guest arriving in a photograph, a moment too late to be part of the composition. A figure, unmoving, indistinct, gone, once acknowledged. She blinked. The corridor behind her was empty. The mirror once more only showed herself, but she did not forget. At breakfast, the atmosphere among the remaining guests had shifted. Clarissa spoke less, often pausing midway through her sentences, her fork left idle on the edge of her plate. Edmund had taken to pacing, small, measured circuits between window and hearth. Dr. Armitage barely touched his food. There was a general avoidance of eye contact, a vague sense that words had begun to weigh too much, and should therefore be rationed. Miss Marple excused herself early. In the study, she examined a mirror above the fireplace, oval again, though newer. This one, too, was wrong. Not broken, not dusty, simply altered. Her reflection arrived in full,
but shifted slightly when she moved, as if the mirror responded not to her body but to her hesitation. At one moment, just before she turned away, she caught the flicker of a smile, but she had not smiled. The day wore on, each mirror becoming a test of courage, each corridor a rehearsal of suspicion. The glass in the upstairs landing bore a hairline crack across its center by noon, though no object had struck it, no staff had touched it, and the wall remained stable. By evening, 2 more had followed. The servants noticed. Miss Blight avoided mirrors altogether, carrying trays at chest height and refusing to pass rooms with visible reflections. When asked, she replied that her eyesight had grown poor and mirrors only made her dizzy. No one questioned it. Clarissa removed the mirror from her own room. Edmund said nothing, but Miss Marple observed him staring for an unusual length of time into the tall cheval glass in the downstairs hall. He stood without movement, long enough that even the dog refused to pass by. That night, Miss Marple sat alone in the library, a candle beside her, and the final journal of Algernon Heathersham open before her, the remaining pages curling slightly at the edges, as though touched too often, or by too many. She turned one slowly, pausing on an entry dated 1 month before the fire. She is not in the house, but the house is in her. Each mirror she touches turns her inward. I saw her face again, but it was mine also. Miss Marple looked up. The mirror above the desk, small and square, was still. Her own reflection stared back, unchanged. She reached forward, and very gently, touched the glass. Cold, but something, somewhere within the reflection moved. Not her, not behind her. Within, she stepped back. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was. Behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And so we proceed.
Chapter 8. Hidden Room Beneath the East Wing. Old houses have long memories, though they do not speak in words. They remember in layers, in creaking floors, in stains no scrubbing removes, in doors that close too slowly or not at all. At Mallow Hill, there was always talk of the East Wing, but never enough of it. It was a part of the house to be acknowledged in passing, not explored. A collection of rooms closed for renovation, or so Clarissa had once said, though no workman had entered them in years. It was an afternoon of uncertain weather, not rain, precisely, but something that pressed gently against the windows and dulled the light. Miss Marple had taken it upon herself to explore the remaining papers in the old butler's cupboard, just off the former servant's staircase, a narrow and dust-choked path that had not felt footfall in some time. Among ledgers and lists of silver went missing during the war, she discovered something unexpected: architectural blueprints. The paper was thick and yellowed, drawn in ink that had faded only slightly, the lines still crisp enough to trace with the tip of a careful finger. It showed Mallow Hill in its entirety, every corridor and staircase accounted for. But in the southeast quadrant of the plan, just beneath the east wing, there was a room, square, windowless, and entirely without entrance. It had no designation, no label, no adjoining hall, just 4 walls. She showed it to Dr. Armitage over tea, presenting it as one might, an unfamiliar plant. He stared at it far longer than necessary, and when he looked up, his face wore an expression somewhere between doubt and fatigue. "I know of no such place," he said, which, in Miss Marple's experience, often meant the opposite. They waited until early evening, when the household had settled into the quiet patterns of those who know not to ask too many questions. Together, they made their way to the east wing, past doors long closed, through air that carried a stillness not born of disuse, but of expectation. It was in the 3rd guest chamber, unused, covered in sheets, that the floorboards changed tone. Beneath a threadbare rug,
lay the faint outline of a trapdoor, worn so smooth it disappeared entirely unless one knew where to look. The edge yielded to pressure, but only just. The latch rusted and resisted. They pried it open together, Armitage straining against years of wood and weight, until it gave with a groan so low it felt heard more in the chest than the ears. Below was a ladder, metal, cold. The air that rose from it was dry, still. Miss Marple descended further. The room beneath was small, square, and perfectly preserved. A nursery. The wallpaper, though faded, was of cheerful design, clouds and balloons. A wooden rocking horse stood in one corner, its paint chipped but intact. Shelves of neatly arranged toys lined one wall, each dustless. A small bed, made with precision, and upon a low table near the bed, a music box. Miss Marple approached it carefully. It was porcelain, shaped like a carousel. Her hand hovered, but she did not touch it. Then, without warning, it began to turn. No hand had moved it, no air stirred. The crank turned slowly, deliberately, and the first notes of a lullaby played out into the room, clear and unhurried. Dr. Armitage whispered, "I know that tune. Clarissa used to hum it as a child." Miss Marple did not respond. They listened as the melody continued, each note echoing against walls that should have absorbed the sound, not returned it. When it stopped, it did so not with a falter, but with precision, as though it had been wound for exactly this purpose, and nothing more. On the wall near the door was a drawing, perhaps by a child. 3 figures, one taller, 2 smaller, none with faces. One held a balloon, one held a doll. The taller one held nothing. Miss Marple examined the floor. The dust lay thick in every corner, yet their own footprints were not the first to disturb it. A narrow track led to the back wall, where something had once been hung. The outline of a square, slightly cleaner than the wall around it, remained. "A picture frame," she said softly. Armitage nodded, reluctantly. "Or a mirror." The silence wasn't empty. It was watching. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. And so we continue. Chapter 9. The Family Secret. A house does not grieve openly. It settles, and it waits. Sometimes it waits so long that the sorrow it carries ceases to feel like memory and begins to take on the character of breath itself, unseen, unspoken, but always present. At Mallow Hill, the waiting had gone on for years, folded neatly into the corners of hallways, pressed into the grooves of banisters, and stitched invisibly beneath every sheet that covered a piece of unused furniture. But the house had not forgotten. Miss Marple had returned to the nursery beneath the east wing twice since she and Dr. Armitage first uncovered it. Once to confirm that the music box had indeed ceased its melody, and again to be certain that the air had not shifted while she was away. But it had, in ways she could not explain. The bedsheets, still untouched, held no dust upon their centre, only at the corners. The rocking horse had moved by inches, no more, though the air was still and the room undisturbed. The drawing on the wall, once faded, now showed sharper outlines than she remembered, as if time itself had reversed direction, and the past refused to be left behind. That morning, after a short exchange with Miss Blight, who had taken to avoiding eye contact altogether, Miss Marple made her way quietly to Edmund's study. She knocked once, firmly. The reply came with a pause too brief to suggest surprise, too long to be casual. "Come in." He was seated behind his desk, the lamplight casting faint shadows along his cheekbones, his hands folded before him, as if expecting a negotiation. He did not rise. Miss Marple sat across from him, taking her time to arrange her skirt, her hands resting in her lap. Then, without preamble, she began. "There was another child, wasn't there?" His expression did not change, but the knuckles of one hand tightened, subtly. A girl, she continued, younger than Clarissa. Her name was Elspeth. He blinked, slowly, as though considering whether denial would serve him or whether it might arrive too late. She drowned at 12, in the lake. The silence between them was measured, not empty. He spoke carefully. You've heard stories. I've read journals, watched the way the servants speak of closed doors, seen the photograph, with her image carefully obscured. I've heard the music box in the nursery, the one she loved, the one still playing. A pause. There is no nursery. There is, below the east wing, a room that does not exist on the modern plans, but was built to be forgotten. His voice, though calm, lost a measure of its polish. You shouldn't have gone down there, and yet I did. His gaze drifted toward the window. For a long moment, he said nothing. It was an accident, he said. Perhaps, Miss Marple allowed. But the story does not end with her disappearance. It ends with silence. And Lucille, he turned sharply. That girl was dismissed. She had no place here. Was she dismissed? Or did she leave because she could no longer carry the weight of what she knew? He did not answer, not with words, but something in his posture collapsed slightly. She was the last to see Elspeth alive, Miss Marple said. You told the villagers. She ran away, but she remained close enough for the lake to reclaim her, for the water to speak, what none of you would. He stood then, walked to the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. You're asking questions that can't be answered, because you were told not to, or because you chose not to. His back stiffened. Elspeth wasn't well, he said finally. She would say things about the house, about the lake. She said someone was waiting for her beneath the water, a woman who wore her face. Miss Marple tilted her head. She had episodes, you mean? We called them that. Clarissa tried to keep her calm. My father ignored it. Lucille encouraged her fantasies, or listened when no one else would. He didn't respond, but the silence that followed was not that of victory. It was exhaustion. Miss Marple rose. The past is no longer content to remain buried. Whether or not Elspeth drowned, her absence lives on. And the house, Edmund, the house remembers, more clearly than you do. As she left, the mirror in the hallway reflected two figures. Only one had entered. The other lingered longer than it should have, long enough to be noticed if one was the type to notice such things, but no one was watching. Nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly... Chapter 10. The Letters of Elspeth. Some messages are not meant to be delivered. They are meant to be hidden, not to be sent, but to remain behind, as proof that someone once dared to speak aloud what no one else would name. It was with this thought that Miss Marple returned again to the nursery, lantern in hand, silence her only companion. The room had not changed, not perceptibly, yet there was an undeniable tension in the stillness, a coiled presence, like a breath held too long. She moved carefully, allowing her steps to echo just faintly enough to remind the walls she was there. The air was dry, but the floor near the far wall bore a faint trail of something darker than dust, and the corner near the small writing table held a quiet invitation, a thin gap in the panelling, just above the baseboard. She knelt. The gap revealed a hollow space behind the wall, no deeper than a hand's width. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, tied with faded red ribbon, was a bundle of letters, more than a dozen, each folded twice, childlike, with no envelope. The paper was yellowed and brittle at the edges, but the handwriting, surprisingly neat for its age, was legible, round, deliberate, almost cautious. Each letter began the same way. Dear Mother Grey. Miss Marple read in silence, the pages resting carefully in her lap. The first letter spoke of dreams, a lake that sang at night, a woman with hair like roots and eyes that did not blink. Elspeth, perhaps no more than 10 when she wrote it, described the woman as kind, but strange. She never spoke, unless spoken to. She always appeared in the water, never on land. In the second letter, Elspeth asked if Mother Grey could see the house from the lake. She said she waved from her window, but wasn't sure if anyone waved back. She asked if Mother Grey had children, if she had always lived beneath the surface. The third letter took a different tone. You said something last night. I heard it. Even though I was asleep. You said come home. But I am already home. And in the fourth, Clarissa doesn't believe in you. But I do. I believe you see me. I believe you know what happened in the East Wing. Miss Marple paused. She glanced at the music box. It had not played since their last visit, but she found herself expecting the first notes at any moment. The fifth letter was shorter. I saw your face in the mirror. It looked like mine, but older. The sixth and seventh mentioned Lucille. The maid was kind. Elspeth wrote. She brushed her hair and told her she wasn't mad, that it was okay to talk to things others could not see, that sometimes people forgot things on purpose. The eighth letter was never finished. It ended mid-sentence. If you ask again, I think I will say yes. I don't want to, but I think I. Miss Marple turned the page. There was no continuation. The rest of the letters grew more erratic. The handwriting slanted. The thoughts tangled. One spoke of Clarissa crying outside the nursery door. Another claimed that father was angry because she had drawn a picture of the woman in the lake, and he said that no one must ever mention that name again. You said the water remembers. I asked Clarissa what that meant, and she just cried again. And sometimes I think you are the only person who tells the truth. She read more slowly now. The further she went, the more apparent it became that the correspondence was more than mere invention. These were not stories to frighten siblings or a game to amuse a child. These were entreaties, observations, moments of reaching out to something or someone who responded in ways only the girl seemed to understand. You said it has to be someone. You said it was meant to be me. The final letter bore a smudge across the lower half, as though it had been held with wet hands. Its last line read, I will come to you tomorrow, if the moon is the same. If it isn't, I will wait. Miss Marple sat in silence. She read them again, slowly, carefully. They were not fiction. They were not written for attention. They were a child's quiet confessions to someone no one else believed existed. Mother Grey. The name echoed faintly, as if the walls themselves had grown used to it. The lake, the nursery, the mirror, each pointed back to this unseen figure. Later that night, Miss Marple carried the letters to her room. She laid them on the bed, examined them under light. A pattern began to form. The dates corresponded not just with journal entries from Algernon, but with weather records she had found in an old gardener's log. The nights when the moon hung low and orange, the ones Elspeth had marked. One letter had a line scratched out violently. You told me secret. You said I should keep them even if they scare me. You said people forget on purpose, but the water does not. And below it, nearly illegible, you said we are the same, that you used to be me. She closed the letters gently, as one might return a personal artifact to a place of reverence. The house creaked as the wind stirred faintly outside, though the windows had been still all day. From somewhere within the manor, perhaps near the east wing, perhaps just below, the soft echo of water against stone could be imagined, if one allowed themselves the indulgence. Miss Marple did not allow for such indulgence often, but tonight she considered it. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her.
Chapter 11, Night of the Blood Moon. Some nights are written in ink so dark that even dawn hesitates to touch them. That evening at Mallow Hill was one of those nights. It began as others had, with quiet routines and cold tea, with boots drying near the hearth and long shadows slipping between rooms as the day closed its eyes. But there was a heaviness to the air, not in temperature, but in intent. The house was waiting, and outside, the moon had risen red. It was Clarissa who first remarked upon the sky. She stood in the upper corridor, peering through the long pane of glass above the staircase landing, her voice uncertain.
"It's the moon," she said, though no one had asked. "It looks not right." Below her, Miss Marple sat by the fire in the drawing room, eyes closed but not sleeping. The crackle of the flames disguised the faint creaks from above, and she did not move until a draught reached her, a breeze that should not have existed in a room with every window shut tight. When she opened her eyes, the flame danced sideways, as though pushed. There was a sound then, a door slamming, not once, twice, 3 times in succession, but from different directions, upstairs, then across the hall, then behind her. Armitage entered at that moment, his hair dishevelled, lantern swinging. Lights are going, first upstairs, now the main corridor. The generator's fine, but he stopped, noticing the tension in her posture. "Have you seen Clarissa?" she asked. He frowned. "She was by the window 10 minutes ago. But when they checked, she was not." It was then that the noise began, a low hum, more felt than heard, vibrating faintly through the floorboards, the sound of something pressing against the bones of the house. Miss Marple followed it to the library, her steps slow but without hesitation. The door opened without resistance, but the room was dark. Inside, the portraits on the wall had shifted, not in their frames, but within them, the eyes no longer aligned. One canvas showed Alden Havisham, but his gaze pointed not forward, but over his shoulder. Miss Marple touched the frame gently. The canvas was warm. A rustle from the corridor. Dr. Armitage called for Edmund, his voice firm, but Edmund did not reply. They checked the study, the cellar door, the greenhouse. He was gone, but he had not left the house. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room and found Mrs. Blight trembling. The old woman had something in her hands, a camcorder. One of the guests had brought it, she said, as part of a travel documentary they were hoping to shoot. A quiet scholar from Oxford, who had joined for the weekend. His name escaped her now. She said she hadn't seen him since dusk. Miss Marple rewound the footage. The image was grainy. The camera had been left running. It showed the upper hallway, empty at first, then movement. The scholar, nervous, pacing. He spoke softly to himself, then looked directly into the lens. "I heard someone call my name," he whispered. "I'm going to check the east wing." The timestamp rolled forward. The angle changed as he turned the camera to face the corridor. He approached the end, stopped at the double doors. He hesitated, then opened them. The screen flickered. A shadow crossed the far end. Quick, too fast to identify. The man gasped, moved the camera toward the staircase. Then the footage stuttered, and in the final frame before the camera dropped, a shape, elongated arms, a face too pale, eyes hollow, reached across the corner of the screen, not toward the camera, toward him. Then darkness. Mrs. Blight was weeping now, rocking slightly. "He was just going to film the old woodwork," she murmured. That's all. Miss Marple placed the device aside. She moved again through the house. The lights above flickered now and then. The clocks all stopped at different hours. The air grew heavier with every step. Behind the stairs, she paused. The mirror had changed again. Now it showed the corridor, not as it was, but as it had been. She saw Elspeth, standing small and still, wearing a nightgown. The girl did not speak. Her mouth was closed, but her expression asked something silently. Then, a blink, and the girl was gone. Clarissa was found near dawn, huddled in the cellar, barefoot. She remembered little, only that someone had called to her from under the floor, a voice she recognized, though not from memory. "She said I was late," Clarissa whispered. "She said I'd forgotten, but I never knew what I was meant to remember." Dr. Armitage examined her, physically unharmed, mentally unanchored. The others stayed close together after that. Chairs pulled in, doors locked, windows shuttered. The house had grown louder. the floors groaning beneath weight that seemed heavier than steps. Outside, no animals stirred, no birds called. Miss Marple sat by the window then, watching the light return, a pale, unwilling dawn. In the sky the blood moon slowly faded, but its mark had been left on the manor, in the silence, in the Chapter 12. Marple's Trap. The hour before midnight was always the quietest, not because the house rested, but because it held its breath. Something in the walls of Mallow Hill had grown attentive, cautious. In that stillness, Miss Marple began her final arrangement. It was not a matter of logic, nor of confrontation. It was the placement of trust in the silence, and the invitation to see what answered. She waited until the others had retreated. Clarissa had been dosed lightly with laudanum by Dr. Armitage, and now lay beneath heavy quilts in the east bedroom, her eyes closed, her breath even, yet in the candlelight her hands moved restlessly, fingers twitching as if playing a forgotten melody. Miss Marple took nothing with her but a lantern, and the old page from Algernon Havisham's journal, the one that remained half-torn, faded at the edges. It spoke again of the girl in white, the one who walked the halls when all doors were locked, and who whispered to him from inside the nursery walls. The old woman returned to that place now. She had made a decision. The drawing room would serve. It was a nexus. Doors from 5 directions, a chimney that wound up from the cellar, and mirrors on both the east and west walls. One by one, she darkened the lamps until only a single candle remained, burning low on the table beneath the central mirror. And then she waited. She did not wait long. There was a creak at the back of the room. A footstep, soft and careful. Miss Marple did not turn. The mirror in front of her, however, showed the slightest displacement of air. Behind her, Clarissa's voice spoke. But it wasn't Clarissa. "He made a promise," the voice said, "and he broke it. So I waited." Marple remained still. "Why now?" she asked the mirror. The voice faltered. "Because someone called me back." In the corridor outside, Dr. Armitage stood frozen. He had seen Clarissa slip from her bed, but not in sleep. Her face had been expressionless, her eyes entirely black in the lantern light. Within the drawing room, Clarissa stepped into view, her eyes now her own again, but dazed, as if she had walked a great distance. "I can hear her," she whispered, her voice cracking. "All the time. But there is someone else too, someone older." Miss Marple guided her to the chair, gently. Clarissa wept then, suddenly and without warning, her body shaking, and from beneath the hearthrug, a sound. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. Dr. Armitage moved quickly, lifting the rug. There was no trapdoor, but the floorboards were cracked, and something had pushed upward, just slightly, enough to break the grain. The candle extinguished. Total black. A scream, but not Clarissa. From the back stairwell, they ran. Mrs. Blight was found in the alcove, outside the servants' pantry, collapsed sideways, against the wood-panelled wall. Her hands were clenched tight, fingers rigid, and in one, a page, torn, smudged, the final piece from the journal. No sign of intrusion. The pantry door was still locked, the windows closed. Her face was still. Dr. Armitage said only, "She didn't fall." Miss Marple opened the page carefully. The writing was faint, but legible. Mother Grey said she would keep the child safe, but only if the others stayed away. She is the water. She is the voice in the glass. Clarissa sank to her knees. She was trying to stop it, she murmured. All this time, she thought the girl would be forgotten, that if no one asked, no one would come. The mirror in the corridor cracked then, a clean, diagonal line. Miss Marple turned away from it. They were too close now. Whatever waited in Mallow Hill no longer lingered in shadows. It watched, and it remembered. Later that same night, while the others sat in the main parlour, unwilling to separate, Miss Marple returned to the nursery.
the place where everything had once begun, and would likely end. She examined the corners of the room, ran her hand gently along the edge of the faded crib, and found, tucked just behind a loose panel near the windowsill, a locket. Inside was a photograph, a young girl, unmistakably Elspeth, and a woman not Clarissa, not anyone from the current house. But her eyes were sharp, knowing. On the back of the locket was a single etched phrase, worn by time, but decipherable under firelight, kept beneath, called above. She showed it to Dr. Armitage, who quietly confirmed it was Lucille, the maid who vanished, a maid who had, perhaps, been much more than servant to the Havisham family. His voice was low, his tone uncertain. She was the last to see Elspeth, he said, and she's never truly left. Outside, a dog barked once, then whimpered. Inside, the candle flames flickered inward. It was no longer a question of haunting. It was a matter of return. Miss Marple placed the locket near the fireplace, open to the air. She whispered nothing, asked for nothing, but the fire grew higher. Clarissa stood in the doorway then. I didn't want to know, she said. But you always did, Miss Marple answered, and in the next room, the grandfather clock ticked again, for the first time in years. Next, the final key would turn, and with it, the house would speak. We are not yet finished, but we are.
Chapter 13. The True Killer. There are nights when a house feels less like a place, and more like a presence, when every creaking board is a breath, every shifting shadow, a memory not quite laid to rest. The night following Mrs. Blight's discovery was one such night at Mallow Hill, and as dawn refused to come, Miss Marple knew there were still truths that had not risen. In the morning, a hush blanketed the estate, but it was not peace, it was preparation. Clarissa remained silent, her eyes following movements no one else could see. Dr. Armitage sat with the journal fragments pieced before him, lips pressed thin, unmoving, and Edmund, cold, composed Edmund, stood at the window in the drawing-room, arms behind his back, watching the fog press tightly against the glass, as if it too were seeking entry. Miss Marple approached him without a sound. "Your sister nearly died last night," she said, voice quiet yet absolute. He turned, slowly. "She walks in her sleep," she spoke in another voice, one that referred to a promise broken. Edmund blinked. "Lucille kept secrets," he replied. "That housemaid always did know more than she should." Miss Marple studied him. She knew about Elspeth. He inhaled sharply. Not outrage, not surprise, just sharpness, a fissure in a man otherwise carved from cold restraint. "You were told she drowned," Miss Marple continued, her voice as calm as tea poured under a rose arbor. "You were told she wandered into the lake, following the image of a woman in the water, but that story was created, by you, to cover something else." Edmund said nothing. "Lucille knew," Miss Marple pressed, and she stayed silent until she no longer could. The man turned from the window then. His face bore no expression. "Have you ever watched someone slip beneath the surface and not come back up? Not because they couldn't swim, but because they chose not to resist the pull." The old woman looked at him, unflinching. She was 12. Edmund's lips twitched, but it was not a smile. She said Mother Grey called to her, that she wanted to be with her. I thought it was nonsense. But she wouldn't stop, she wouldn't eat. She spent her nights talking to the walls. He paused. The fireplace behind them crackled. The air tightened. "That afternoon she followed me to the lake, said I had to come meet her friend, and his voice faltered like a candle in a gust. The silence between them was not empty, it was watching. Clarissa entered then, quietly. She held the locket, found in the nursery. Her hand trembled. "She left this behind," she said. "That day, Miss Marple he did not try to save her, Clarissa. He pushed her." Clarissa trembled. "Why?" Edmund's voice was flat. Because she would have taken me with her. There was no trial, no confession signed in ink, only silence and the flickering of light as it failed to warm the corners of the house. That evening they found a letter in the library, untouched for years, tucked inside a hollowed volume of poetry. It was addressed to Lucille. "He doesn't understand," the letter read. "She says he can't hear her, because he lies too often. But you heard her. You said you believe she is real. If I go with her, will you follow?" It was signed Elspeth. Later, a deeper search unearthed a child's journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the nursery. It was scarcely legible in parts, scrawled with drawings of tall reeds, a woman with blank eyes, and a crooked tree by the shore. The final page simply read, "She waits in the water when the moon turns red." The lake was quiet that night, but not still. Reflections shifted without breeze, and in the upstairs corridor, the mirror fractured further, threads of silver light splitting like veins beneath the glass. Clarissa refused supper. Instead, she sat by the fire and whispered. Dr. Armitage asked her to whom she spoke. "She's not gone," she replied. "She came back, but she brought something with her, something that wasn't ever meant to leave the water." Miss Marple said nothing. Instead, she lit a single candle and placed it beside the portrait of the Havisham children. It flickered, and just for a moment, the shadow of a fourth figure appeared in the painting, a girl in white, too faint to name. Later, she stood by the edge of the lake, holding the pages of the journal. They fluttered in the wind, not as paper, but as warnings. Behind her, footsteps, familiar, yet wrong. "Clarissa." "No." She turned. A child stood there, barefoot, dressed damp, eyes full of something older than grief. And just like that, the girl was gone. Marple bent and placed the pages into the hollow of the tree beside the water. She did not speak aloud. She simply nodded. Once, because the house had spoken, and she had listened. 2 chapters remain, and then the past will no longer wait.
Chapter 14. The final confrontation. There are moments in a house's life when the walls no longer hold memory, but speak it aloud. That night, Mallow Hill exhaled such a moment. It began with silence, but not the kind born of peace. This was the silence that watches, weighs. Miss Marple had prepared the nursery hours earlier. Everything had been returned exactly as it once was, save for a single addition, a faded page, no larger than a hand, laid gently upon the rocking chair. It was the final missing entry from the journals, long thought destroyed, its edges scorched but legible. A page Edmund never intended to see again. She stood alone in the corridor for a time, the gaslight low, the air touched by the cool breath of something older than draught. She did not speak, she merely waited. Edmund arrived with no announcement. His face was as stone, but there was something behind his eyes now, a flicker, a tension, as though he'd begun to remember something he had spent years convincing himself had never occurred. "You asked to meet me here," he said flatly. "I did," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle, almost grandmotherly, as if she were simply preparing tea and not unveiling the last secret a house was desperate to conceal. "I thought you might want to read this." She stepped aside, allowing the light to fall onto the page. He approached, slower than necessary, each step accompanied by the faintest creak. When he reached the chair, he stared not at the journal page, but at the chair itself, and then to the toys resting on the shelf beside it. He did not reach out. "You remember the day she vanished," Miss Marple said. "You told yourself a story, and then, over time, it became easier to repeat than to question." Edmund finally looked at the page. She wasn't the same," he murmured, voice not quite his own. "You wrote this," Miss Marple said, almost tenderly. He flinched. The words were jagged, scrawled in haste. "She looks like Elspeth, but speaks with a voice. I do not know."
She walks without sound. She sees things I cannot. She says the lake brought her back, but the lake took something from her too. I don't believe it's her. I don't think it ever was. And beneath that, shakier, if I leave the door open, she might leave, but what if she doesn't go alone? Behind them the air shifted, a pressure, as if the house inhaled. Edmund stepped back. I buried that page. You hid it, Marple said. But you didn't destroy it. The window began to tremble. Light flickered. Clarissa's voice called from down the hall, though she had not entered. The water. It's rising. Edmund turned toward the door and paused. He saw it too. Beneath the nursery's floorboards, the faintest sound, trickling, rhythmic and wet. The scent of lake water hung in the air, carried on wind that had no origin. The lake was not still. It had moved. It had reached the house. Do you believe it now? Miss Marple asked quietly. He sank to the edge of the rocking chair, his voice faltering. I thought, if I could ignore it long enough, it would go away. The house groaned, a sound like shifting timbers, no deeper than that, like breath from a mouth made of stone and silt. Clarissa appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide. She's here. Who? Miss Marple asked. Clarissa's voice was steady, but her gaze never left the shadows at the far end of the room. The one who never left the lake. And then, the music box began. It had not been wound. The lullaby was warped, each note stretched as if passed through water. Edmund stood, suddenly, and turned to Miss Marple. She never forgave me. I see that now. She didn't ask for your forgiveness. The old woman replied. She asked to be believed. The wallpaper began to peel from the corners, curling like old parchment. The carpet darkened in patches, as though touched by water, rising invisibly, marking the room's edge. Clarissa stepped forward. You thought you buried it all, but she was never buried. Not truly. Behind the mirror, a faint crack spread. Miss Marple placed her hand on the windowsill, where the mist outside now pulsed softly, light moving beneath its folds, like something just beneath the lake's surface. There was one truth left unspoken, she said, mostly to herself, and it was waiting for this night. The page on the rocking chair curled upward. Outside, the wind stilled. Inside, the nursery sighed, and somewhere beneath their feet, a door that had never been seen, nor named, opened with a sound that was not wood on wood, but stone on bone. They did not speak, because the house was telling the truth now, and they were listening. To be continued in the final chapter. Chapter 15. Mallow Hill will sleep again. There are final acts in life, not marked by applause, but by silence, the kind of silence that settles thickly on the skin, refusing to be brushed away. The kind that lingers long after the players have gone, after the final words have been spoken, and even the ghosts themselves are too weary to whisper. Morning came at Mallow Hill, not with celebration, but with a hushed reverence. The storm had passed, yet the air was still heavy with the weight of revelations too large for words. It did not feel like closure. It felt like retreat. The constables arrived just after dawn, their boots squelching against the muddy grounds, their hats tipped in deference to the estate's ancient weight. The lake, still rippling from the night's tumult, offered no reflection. The nursery, once sealed by generations of grief, stood open, and Edmund Havisham, he was nowhere to be found. No footprints led away, no signs of struggle remained. Only the faint scent of old paper, cold air, and absence. The house exhaled. Its walls, long burdened by silence and denial, now echoed faintly with something that was neither mourning nor release. Clarissa wandered the corridors like a figure in a waking dream, clutching Elspeth's locket to her chest, her footsteps soft, unsure. The staff had withdrawn into their rooms, too shaken to speak, too cautious to ask. No one dared go near the east wing, not after what they heard, or what they thought they heard. Miss Marple had not waited for explanations. She had no need. She had already understood. As the fog lifted across the gardens, she sat once more in the library, the last of the journals on her lap. Her eyes scanned the words one final time, though her mind was elsewhere. She traced the edge of the final page, the one that had been folded tightly in Miss Light's hand, a final desperate grasp. In it, the youngest Havisham had written her final words. She waits by the water. She told me she is lonely, that she remembers everything, even when they pretend she wasn't real. She is still here. I am going to sit with her, so she won't be alone anymore. Tell Edmund I forgive him. Tell Clarissa I miss her laugh. Tell Mother Grey she doesn't have to whisper. I am listening. It was signed, simply, Elspeth. Outside, the wind had changed. The reeds at the edge of the lake no longer rustled. They stood still, reverent. A ripple moved across the water, though no stone had fallen. And in the nursery, the music box, long silenced, played once, a single chime, then silent. By midday, the police had searched the grounds, and the lake's edge. No sign of Edmund, no evidence of foul play. He had vanished, as if swallowed by the past itself. Perhaps in a way he had been. There were whispers, of course. Some said he had fled. Others claimed the house had taken him. Miss Marple offered no opinion. She had left something behind, a letter, addressed to Clarissa, sealed in wax. Its contents, later shared by the girl herself, were simple and haunting. Some ghosts want justice, others just want company. The staff would later recall that Mallow Hill changed that day, not outwardly. Its windows still gleamed in the afternoon sun, its corridors remained richly carpeted, and its clocks ticked in measured elegance. But something was different. The air was lighter, and yet from time to time, a guest might feel as though they were being observed. The mirrors remained covered now, by Clarissa's request, and the drawing room was never again used after dark. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned to her little cottage in St. Mary Mead. Her garden was in bloom, the scent of lavender thick in the air. She unpacked her suitcase, placed the journals in a wooden box, and tucked them away in the back of her cupboard. Some stories, she believed, should remain stories, no matter how true. The afternoon sun cast shadows across her parlour. On the mantel, a portrait had been hung, an old copy of the Havisham family. But now, if one were to look closely, very closely, they might see something new. The girl at the back, once with downcast eyes, seemed to now raise her gaze, and perhaps, just perhaps, she smiled. Miss Marple did not look at it often, but she noticed the change, and she nodded, once, as if to say, yes, I see you. Later that evening, with the windows open, and the scent of rain on the breeze, she poured herself a cup of tea. The kettle hissed, the steam curling upward in soft spirals. She settled into her chair, journal on her lap, pencil poised but unmoving. Across the room, her mirror flickered, once, twice, and then again, not broken, not cracked, but as if someone had passed behind her, just outside the edge of reflection. She did not turn. She did not need to. A silhouette lingered just a moment too long. Elspeth, smiling, and then she was gone. The teacup in front of her, empty just a moment before, began to fill, drop by drop. Water, cold and clear, pooling gently at the bottom. No source, no sound, just presence. She did not stop it. She only watched, and then sipped her tea, because some endings do not end. They wait, and some houses do not forget. They remember. Before we part, dear viewer, if you have come with us this far, then you have truly watched, and for that, I offer this. Did you catch the secret in the family portrait? Tell us in the comments. You might just have seen what others missed. And now,
One final reminder, should you wish to accompany Miss Marple again, do subscribe. There are more mysteries yet to unravel. Next time, we follow her to the quiet village of Brambleford, where bells toll not for time, but for truth. Until then, sleep lightly. The silence isn't always empty, sometimes it's watching. Mallow Hill will sleep again, but not forever.